Hello everybody, I'm Bitter, and welcome to the final part of my Season 1 review, Thomas and Friends. There's 3 episodes today, Episode 24, Off the Rails, Episode 25, Down the Mine, and Episode 26, the final episode for Season 1, Thomas's Christmas Party. I'd like to get through this so we can do some more topical videos, not that I don't enjoy the reviews, but it's dragging on because of the way I managed my workflow. I'll do better next season. Season 1, Episode 24. Off the Rails. Time for another Gordon episode. Gordon was resting in a siding, thinking about how great he is. Henry rolls up next to him, and we get this little interaction.
Hello, fat face. What? Gee, that Henry is too big for his wheels. Fancy speaking to me like that. Me, who has never had an accident.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing. Percy asks Gordon if burst safety valves and jammed whistles count as accidents, and Gordon plays them off as things that could happen to any engine. But to come off the rails like Henry did, is it right? Is it decent? When it was Henry's turn to take the express, Gordon made a comment about staying on the rails today. This episode has some of the best insults in the season. It's not quite as mean as calling your physically disabled friend fat and lazy like Thomas did, but there's some good ones here. Henry left in a huff and Gordon went back to sleep in his siding. Not for long though. A special goods train had come up and Gordon was needed to pull it. Trucks? Pah! His fire was slow to start, so Edward moved him onto the turntable. Gordon was grumbling like a child, and Edward had told him not to be silly. The movement stirred his fire into life and it was burning nicely. He was running out of ways to get out of pulling this train. When they began to turn him, he waited until the table was halfway around and moved forward. His plan was just to jam the turntable, but he couldn't stop himself and ran right into a ditch.
Oh, she hissed. Get me out! Get me out!
He was well and truly stuck. His crew called the fat controller, who looked down on the yard from his office, seeing Gordon off the rails. He tells them to have Edward take the train, and Gordon, leave him where he is. We haven't the time to bother with him now. Some schoolboys mocked Gordon and sang about it. Gordon laid in that ditch all day, and that night James and Henry came to help him free. They lifted him with cranes and lay a road of sleepers under him to prevent him slipping back in. Strong ropes were fastened to him, and James and Henry pulled him free. It's just James if you look at the screen, but ignore that. Henry's just got an invisibility cloak. Pulling hard, they get him safely back on the rails, and late that night he crawled home a sadder and wiser engine, still carrying some of the contents of the ditch on his buffer beam. Review time. The music isn't anything super special, but we do get the breakdown train music again, and that's nice. There's a piece of music that plays while Gordon's on the turntable. I think it also played in Thomas's train. It's short and sweet, and always seems to accompany trouble. It's very fitting for this sort of series, isn't it? The visuals are surprisingly varied here. I'm really impressed with this. The entire episode takes place in 2 locations, Knapford Station and I believe this is Knapford Sheds. But we get a huge variety of new angles, and a new set in the Fat Controller's office, which overlooks the shed. That's one hell of a view to have. No new angles at Knapford Station, but we do get new cab shots looking at Gordon's fire. They do a lot with the ditch here, and because there's so few locations here, I think the set dressing can be appreciated to its fullest. When the boys are mocking Gordon, one of them's sitting on some old junk that was just left there. From a couple of angles, you get to see the workman's hut on the other side of the ditch. Just imagine you're having a nap in there and then the sound of 90 tons of metal running off the rails rattles you awake. No good rest for anybody on this island. And then the rescue operation later. Henry and James are meant to be pulling together here, but there's nowhere for Henry to be. I guess he's invisible now. The fog and workmen all over the place go a long way to making this feel more real. They're all monitoring and adjusting the situation. There's some cool looking lights moving in the background, I think it's a truck, and a crane behind Gordon moves once as if they had only one shot to rotate it. And it moved fast. The set feels really alive, and Gordon keeping the ditch plants with him when he backs into the sheds feels almost symbolic of his bad decisions. But James needs to work on his smile. A little creepy in this lighting. So, onto the story. The story doesn't feel all that rushed, and the characters are in their right place. You already kinda know who Gordon is and how he's going to react to this sort of thing, so there's no need for a bunch of setup on that front. His stories so far involve him getting a big head and doing something stupid. This is the most at fault he's ever been up to this point, though. Getting stuck on hills or being sent down the wrong line really could happen to anybody. Putting yourself in a ditch is something you've got to do yourself. Percy gets along with Gordon. He'd get along with anyone if they give him the chance, it seems. Henry has no problem making fun of Gordon here as well, which is refreshing, and Gordon doesn't really hold back with him either. In the last episode, Toby and Percy bounced off of each other to tease James, and they were only making fun of his arrogance. Here, Henry calls Gordon fat, and Gordon gets back at him by reminding him of a near-death experience. In this context, it's a silly little kids show, but if you heard someone saying these things in person, you'd be absolutely shocked at what you overheard. They have an interesting dynamic here because they're supposedly friends, but they don't give each other any slack. Now, I'm like that with some of the people closest to me, but I don't think that's what's meant to be happening here. They're just doing their best to be mean, and I love it. Also, Edward continues to be reasonable and therefore hardly relevant. 9 out of 10. I think the story could have been a little bit more meaningful, maybe. There's nothing wrong with the episode, but it's missing the spark that makes a 10 out of 10. There's a lot of great things about it. The 2 locations were used amazingly well. The story is enjoyable, as it usually is with Gordon stories, and the music was great. That's what separates it from a 10 out of 10, I believe. The music throughout the entire season is great. The Flying Kipper music was just special. James and the Trucks had some special music. This isn't special, it's just really good. I know that may seem a bit nitpicky, but I'm gonna call it a 9 out of 10. It's no more nitpicky than I was with Thomas in Trouble, I suppose. Season 1, Episode 25, Down the Mine. One day, Thomas was at the junction when Gordon pulled in with some trucks.
Phew, what a funny smell.
Thomas teased Gordon for a bit, saying he smells like ditch water. Annie and Clarabelle were shocked at this. They had a great respect for Gordon and could hardly believe what they had heard. They tried to lecture Thomas about how rude that was, but he didn't care. He was still feeling pleased with himself when it was time to take his next train. He dropped off the coaches in a siding and went off to a mine for some trucks. Long ago, miners had made tunnels underground here. Their supports were strong enough to hold the ground and some trucks, but they could never support an engine. There was a big notice board warning engines to not pass it, but Thomas thought he knew better. He often tried to pass it, and this morning he made a plan. His fireman was off the footplate changing points, and his driver was hanging out the cab. This was his chance. He bumped some trucks hard, knocking the driver out of his cab. His driver yelled at him to come back, but it was far too late. Thomas had realized too late as well that he had made a terrible decision. In no time, he was resting face down in a hole. Thomas was talking to himself about how stupid he was being, and the Fat Controller walked up and agreed with him. He just kind of appeared here. Don't worry about it. He saw the whole thing, and Thomas asked him to get him out. The Fat Controller thought for a moment. The ground isn't stable enough for a crane, so I wonder if Gordon can get you out. Thomas agreed, but he really wasn't ready to see Gordon yet. Gordon laughed as he rolled down the line to the mine. He had come with a winch attached and a good attitude about the job, telling Thomas that we'll have you out in a couple of puffs. Strong cables were fastened between the two, and the Fat Controller told Gordon to give it a pull. It was more work than they thought, but Gordon eventually pulled Thomas back up and onto the rails. Thomas apologized for being so rude. Gordon thanked him for giving him a good laugh, and the two made an alliance as Gordon helped Thomas home. Review time. So, there's a piece of music in here that we may have heard before, and to be honest, it took me longer to figure out what it was than it did to write the walkthrough for this episode. The music was Annie and Clarabelle's theme. I think it's sweet that the coaches got their own music. There's also a rescue theme that plays here that builds tension while we prepare to pull Thomas out. Good stuff, but nothing super special, at least as far as this show is concerned. Visuals are the really special part for me. There's a bit of pilot footage in here, but everyone has talked about that. First, I want to talk about Gordon running through the small sets. These are places where an engine about Thomas's size looks right, maybe a bit tall. Gordon is a very big engine, and here that's made abundantly clear. He takes a single track section for a little bit, and when he gets closer to the camera, it reminds you that, oh yeah, he's probably not meant to be along these lines. The whole mine looks great, like clearly abandoned. There's something new to see with every camera angle, and the final shot is taken from the mouth of one of the mine shafts, looking out as Gordon pulls Thomas away, the Fat Controller watching and waving at a distance. That shot is just so good. I probably should have put this in the music section, but I switched to using some nice headphones from my cheap desk speakers at about this point, and there's a wind noise through the entire episode. Is every episode like this? Am I crazy? The story leans heavily on the one from the last episode, and they're both build up to an episode that won't be in this season. We'll loop back around to that after we talk about the characters. Gordon made himself look really stupid, and lost his express when he ran himself into a ditch. I assume James and Henry have been pulling it this whole time. He was bound to be in a terrible mood, but when Thomas was teasing him earlier, he hardly seemed to react. It wasn't really his moment, I suppose, but when Thomas jumps down a mine, he laughs the whole way to rescue him. It was just so out there, and on top of that, it was Thomas teasing him earlier, so when he came to rescue Thomas, he still had that smile on his face. Also, he just pulled Thomas out? I can't explain the science myself, but pulling something up and out of a hole is going to require many times more force than pulling it along rails. This would require everything Gordon has and probably more. Then, when Thomas apologizes, Gordon takes it quite gracefully, saying that it's fine, you've made me laugh. The Fat Controller isn't even all that mad here. He was more upset when James got his hat wet. I don't know if he was just taking it easy on Thomas because he was really scared at the time, or if he's just not the most consistent guy, so I won't say much here. But he was just here? He was chilling out at an abandoned mine when Thomas fell into it. He watched this disaster happen and walked over to see what he could do. This place looks utterly abandoned. Why are you here? I thought Thomas was just here to pick up old rolling stock or something. Maybe he's reopening it. The world may never know. It's never mentioned again. As for Thomas, honestly, he's the same as always here. He's a little troublemaker who likes to bother Gordon. He does something very stupid and suffers the consequences like in Thomas and Gordon, the big difference being that Gordon himself wasn't the consequence this time. Gordon was helping Thomas deal with the consequences. His teasing has evolved a bit. It's long jokes instead of just scaring the poor guy. He feels like he's got more ground to stand on, having a branch line and all that, but his cheeky ways aren't changed much. Now back to the story. After these two stories, we're supposed to get Paint Pots and Queens, but for whatever reason that doesn't happen yet. Instead, the larger story ends here. Usually it would be super jarring, but here it's almost okay. It does feel incomplete, but I suppose if I didn't know what was missing, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you that it was missing. The story ends with two characters who've been mean to each other and both looked stupid, becoming better friends than ever. They discard their considerable differences and choose to continue on in a better way. It's sweet, but there's obviously something missing. This is hard. There's good music, there's awesome visuals, and what story is there is obviously incomplete to me. Don't shoot me, I'm gonna give it a 6 out of 10. The music is good, but not great. The visuals are absolutely fantastic and the character work is very nice, but it's a bit hollow. Perhaps, if we spent moderately less time on exposition and travel shots, we could have got the Fat Controller lecturing the engines at the end, and that may have patched the hole. This episode is fun on its own, but it's not meant to be on its own. Alright, this next one's going to be a little bit longer. Season 1, Episode 26, Thomas's Christmas Party. I want to start this before the walkthrough by saying that this is the last episode of the season, and it's exceptionally nostalgic for me, so I may be terribly biased. Keep that in mind, but I also remember the episode being a bit off, even before I wrote this script. Alright, let's get into it. It's nearly Christmas on the island of Sodor, and all of the engines are working hard. Thomas and Toby are pulling people and parcels up and down the branch line. Everyone was happy, only Annie and Clarabelle were complaining, and that's because they were so full of people. Thomas responded to their complaints with cheerful talk of the holidays. By the side of the line was a lonely little cottage and an older woman waving at them.
It's Mrs. Kindly. Peep, peep, Happy Christmas. Thomas always felt better for seeing her. Christmas just wouldn't be Christmas without Mrs. Kindly.
Thomas stopped on the turntable and spoke to all of the other engines except for Toby. He's probably still on the branch line.
All their coats had been polished. Ha, just look at us. Your driver will have to work fast to get you as smart as us.
Thomas wasn't worried about all of that. He was thinking about Mrs. Kindly. He told the engines at the shed that it had been a whole year since she saved Thomas from an accident.
You remember when she was ill in bed and... Yes, of course, interrupted Edward. You told us how she waved her red dressing gown out of her window.
Percy added that they'd given her gifts, and the Fat Controller paid for a trip for her to get better.
But, said James and Henry together, the rest of us have never thanked her properly.
Thomas agreed and said that they should all give her a special Christmas party. The engines were excited, and their drivers were all sure that their controller would agree. Indeed he did, and so the engines began making plans. But the Fat Controller had bad news. The weather was changing, and Mrs. Kindly was snowed in. Toby agreed to help, and Thomas had his snowplow put on and went to set her free. He hated snow, but he hated the idea of leaving her stranded even more. Thomas charged the snowdrifts fiercely. Sometimes they were swept aside, and sometimes the workmen would have to loosen them up before he could break it apart. When they got to the cutting near the cottage, they could go no further. The snow was deep and laid heavily over her home. She waved at them from the upstairs window, and then they heard the familiar sound of Terence the tractor. He's coming to help her get free as well. He had a snowplow attached, and together with the workmen, he was clearing a way for Mrs. Kindly to get to the railway line. At long last, the rescue was complete. Percy brought the tired workmen home, Terence said goodbye to Mrs. Kindly and promised to take care of her cottage as everyone left. The engines had made good time, but when they came home the yard was dark. Thomas's heart sank.
Suddenly, all the lights went on. What a marvelous sight awaited Mrs. Kindly.
There were lights everywhere, a big Christmas banner. The engines all had Santa hats, and even Bertie had come to see them. The Fat Controller, standing on some Legos, congratulated the engines on a job well done and told them he was proud of them. Mrs. Kindly thanked the smaller engines, who had all helped get her free, and they started singing carols. They all thought it was the best Christmas ever, and Mrs. Kindly couldn't think of anywhere better to live than on this island with all of her friends. Review time! The winter music is always a nice change, just enhanced versions of normal themes. All of the engines starting to sing carols at the end is pretty wholesome. The winter visuals are great again. Something about seeing familiar sets all covered in snow feels right. There's a couple of really special things for me though. We get another flashback in this episode, with a landslide that I think is really well done. We actually see the landslide happen. Seeing Terence playing in the snow and the small journey on the way to the cottage was interesting to me. Seeing the workmen so heavily featured here reminds you that there are in fact people on this island, and watching Terence work here was pretty neat. He somehow got here before Thomas and Toby did, and being a tractor, he probably isn't very fast, so he's been at it for a while. Biggest thing to talk about though is the final shot of the sheds, where everyone is gathered for a party. There's lights, there's Santa hats, and even Bertie got a hat. Annie and Clarabelle are split up so they can face the turntable. And there's a giant banner that says Merry Christmas on it. That tree is enormous too. How did they set that up? The only bad thing I've got to say about the visuals is that the Fat Controller is standing on Legos and it bothers me. The story here is a mixed bag. In the Railway series, the landslide happens in a separate story, so it feels natural when it's brought up. Here, it feels like it was shoehorned in. To be honest, trying to fit that whole story at the start of this episode may have been better than making it a flashback. The copious amounts of exposition here feel rather clunky. After the exposition, the story feels quite nice. It's touching that all the engines agree they need to celebrate this sweet old lady. None of the main cast are left out, they all speak, but we don't need to talk about all of them. Gordon spoke for all of the engines at the start. He specifically said they all look good. He spoke positively of all of them. No bullying the tank engines, no calling Edward old, no making fun of James. He's exclusively nice and happy here. This isn't out of character, though. He's been thoroughly humbled. Percy makes friends with absolutely everybody, including Mrs. Kindly. James and Henry have the same thoughts and the same things to say here. Clearly they get along. We don't get many episodes about their dynamic, and I think that's something that's missing in the series. At least seeing them in one place here was nice. There's nothing really to say about Toby and Edward here. They don't really need any character growth at this point. We see the best Thomas himself has to offer here, though. He's very cheerful about the holidays. He's not worried about getting all polished up, and he's happy to work. When Mrs. Kindly gets snowed in, he puts on the snowplow, which he hates, just to go get her free and bring her to the party. He's really sweet throughout the entire episode, and the Fat Controller agrees to throw a party and goes about getting everything set up for it. His kindness extends beyond the engines and to the residents of the island. He paid for a trip for Mrs. Kindly to get better when she was sick as a thank you. Threw her this party. He had Thomas and Toby go help get her free. Even Terence got in on it. Christmas has helped bring the best of the entire cast, it seems, and I really love that. So what's the rating gonna be? 7 out of 10. The start of the episode wanders a lot, and it's telling a story that needs its own episode as the drawn-out introduction to this one. This could have been a really nice two-parter. I assume they didn't want to end it on a two-parter, so they rushed it to death instead. The visuals were great, the music was nice, and seeing all of the characters getting festive was quite sweet. Don't get me wrong, I love this episode, but I think it's kind of bad. It's not the best representation of what the season has to offer, that's for sure. Okay, that's all I've got for the Season 1 review. I will be doing topical videos while I take a month or two off of the review itself. I need to come back at it from a healthier angle. See you next week.